The topic for this talk is empiricism and work and how they're related in Dracula. I'm going to give you a couple of definitions and then take you through just a few examples in the text to illustrate and prove my points. So I'll begin with the working definition of empiricism. It is a particular field of philosophy and science. And this is my working definition of it. It's a deep-rooted belief that truth, progress, science, that is to say, scientific truth and scientific progress, can only be advanced by means of what I'm going to call quantifiable data. Data that you can somehow put a number on or quantify in some way or measure. Alternatively, it could be data that is obtained through the five senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. These are what we call tangibles, and they stand in opposition clearly, for example, to Descartes, whose first principle of reality is consciousness, and that's a much harder thing to quantify or to turn into anything empirical. The underlying issue in empiricism is epistemological, which is to say, how do we come to know what we know? In psychology, they call that cognitive psychology or cognition. In philosophy, it's epistemology. How do you know something to be true or not true? And for the empiricists, the answer is always through quantifiable data and through these five senses, both these means. The underlying belief of scientific empiricism is that every problem can be solved as long as you are somehow collecting enough data. If you can't solve the problem, it means you don't have enough data. Think about, for example, cancer research and how deep-rooted a belief we have in our culture that we will find a cure one day. It's just a matter of getting enough scientists to do enough experiments over enough time before we find the answer, but the answer is findable. So empiricism is also scientifically and medically optimistic about the possibility of a solution. And that in Dracula is tied into a very significant sustained theme of work. And for Freud, let us remember that work is, as I have here, the triumph of the superego as it drives us towards the work or reality principle and further away from the pleasure principle. So work is something that that our superego forces us to do in order to distract us from our innate desire to gratify the pleasure principle. Working with empirical data is how the children of light solve the primal horde theory. So by children of light, I mean the collective, so it's Harker and Van Helsing and Seward and, Quincy and Mina and Lucy. This whole group of people are constantly gathering, typing up or organizing and collecting empirical data as a way to solve what I'm calling the primal horde theory problem of killing the archetypal father. So to rephrase this, the children of light know that they need to kill off Dracula. He is, of course they don't know he's the archetypal father and they never use those words. That's our critical interpretation. However, their problem that they're trying to solve is to destroy Dracula and to restore some kind of control over the women and take back what was in Dracula's hands and put it back into their hands. So empiricism and work go hand in hand in this novel. Now, just a quick further word about empiricism. I've used a pretty straightforward definition. Empiricism, just FYI, is a much deeper, larger topic. This is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. All kinds of different forms of empiricism here, different flavors, explanatory, ancient, medieval, genetic, all kinds of things, cognitive empiricism. I want you to understand that empiricism is more complex and sophisticated than I'm making it, but I am saying we don't need all of this for our analytical purposes in Dracula. Wikipedia has a fairly workable, simple solution. Empiricism states that knowledge comes only from primary or sensory experience. Look who they've got as empiricists here. Francis Bacon, who in The Advancement of Learning talks about the importance of building up to generalizations through very slow, graduated, specific experiments that are tangible and measurable. John Locke, the great 18th century empiricist, talks about this in a work he wrote called An Essay on Human Understanding, and discusses that in a little bit. So for us, this is how we're going to proceed. I am going to pull up, where did it go? Right here. So I'm going to pull up examples on the screen from Dracula. My edition, unfortunately, which I think is the best edition out there, is out of print, and I haven't had time to convert the page numbers, but I'm going to give you chapter numbers and diary entries as a way of hopefully allowing you to catch up or to find these readings in your own text very quickly. One of the nice things about a digital edition online is that by hitting Control F or Command F, you can do a word search throughout the whole novel. So every time the word work appears, you can do a Control F or Command F and trace that word all the way through the novel. So this is in part what I'm going to do here, and to talk to you now and show you how consistent the theme of empiricism in work is in this novel and how it manifests itself. I begin right at the opening of the novel by noting that Jonathan Harker is a meticulous keeper of notes. He is very clear about details, minutia. You know, I had chicken and red pepper, and he's very specific about the times of the train. All of this is a fascination with empirical data. And this is before he even knows about Dracula as a problem. So it's clear that he and most of the children of light are disposed to the study of empiricism. The reason that they need Van Helsing, incidentally, because he's also an empiricist, but Van Helsing also brings to empiricism an additional component that the other children of light do not have, and that component is faith. And so Van Helsing, because he is formerly a clergyman and familiar with religion and ideas of faith and hope, he puts a new, more sophisticated spin on the, let's call it garden variety empiricism of the other characters. So let's take a look at a few quick examples that illustrate the relationship between empiricism and work. And this is in chapter 1 on the 5th of May. It is a passage that begins with Harker talking about his dinner. Again, just to make the point, 5th of May, the gray morning had passed, the sun is high over the distant horizon, blah, blah, blah. There are many odd things to put down, so he's obsessed with collecting empirical data. Unless who reads them may fancy that I dined too well before I left Bistritz, let me put down my dinner exactly. I dined on what they call robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, beef seasoned with red pepper, strung on sticks and roasted over the fire. All of this detail is minutia that he, again, intuitively collects, although at this point in the novel it's purposeless. It doesn't do any, anything, doesn't help him solve any problems, but that impulse, that natural tendency to be empirical in this kind of way is what ends up serving him well. A little further on, and this is in chapter 4. It's there's a diary entry in chapter 4 called 25th of June morning. And then the one after that, a page later, is the same day later. And that is the one that I'm looking at. And so, yeah, this is Harker in the vault of Dracula's basement of his castle. There in one of the great boxes, sorry, I just, here, I went over every inch of ground so as not to lose a chance. I went down even into the vaults where the dim light struggled, although to do so was a dread to my very soul. Into 2 of those I went, but saw nothing except fragments of old coffins and of dust. In the 3rd, however, I made a discovery. There in one of the great boxes, of which there were 50 in all, now these are coffins, on a pile of newly dug earth lay the count. So what I'm pulling out of this passage is the number 50. And this again is an example of Harker obsessed with the minutia of empirical facts. Imagine yourself in this environment. You're in the dungeons, the basement of a castle. You walk in, you see a room full of coffins. Who stops to count them? But he counts them. And again, this is his obsession with empiricism. And so we see that Harker is this way by nature. Now, I want to go on to talk a little bit about the relationship between work and desire from a Freudian perspective. And this is in chapter 14. And it begins, I'm going to find it very quickly here. Here we are, chapter 14. So this is Mina's journal, and I want you to pay attention to what she writes here. Jonathan is better after a bad night. I'm so glad that he has plenty of work to do, for that keeps his mind off the terrible things. Now, those terrible things are, we know from a Freudian perspective, the latent desires that he has repressed. Latent desires for homoeroticism, homosexuality, heterosexual fantasies about sex with multiple women, all of those indulgences of the id, he is busy trying to repress. And we get this great sentence right here. I am so glad that he has plenty of work to do, for that keeps his mind off the terrible things. And there is that relationship between work and the superego and the repression of the unconscious mind or the id. The more you work, the more your superego takes control over your life, the less your pleasure principle drives you, the less influence your id has on you. And so he uses work as a way to continue sublimating and repressing his latent desire. And Mina says it right there in pretty plain terms. Also, just a little bit further, I believe it's also chapter 14. It is 2:30, the 26th of September. Yes, 26th of September, 2:34. Yeah, September 26th. So let me find that journal entry. Right here. So this is Seward. As for myself, I was settling down to my work with the enthusiasm which I used to have for it. So he takes solace and comfort in the fact that work will be able to distract him from his problems. They're all recovering from the trauma, but this idea that work is going to save him from his heartbreak. And look at this. He says, the work might fairly have said that the wound which poor Lucy left on me was becoming cicatrized. And cicatrice is scarring of tissue. Actually, if you look it up, you can see that some people use scarring as an art form instead of tattoos. But what he's talking here is about scar tissue building up on the wound. And because, of course, Lucy has rejected his proposal of marriage, Seward is using work to hide, to avoid, to repress his distress and disappointment, perhaps even anger at having been rejected by Lucy. And again, the function of work there is to keep his state of emotional and psychological anxiety, to keep that sort of stabilized. So his work is going to help him. A little bit further, 267, is chapter 16, right at the end. And it's Van Helsing talking. Right here. So, this is Van Helsing saying, "When I have returned, you will be master of all of the facts, and we can then better enter on our inquisition." Well, this is exactly what empiricism is. You gather all the facts, and if you just get enough facts accumulated, you are going to be able to solve the problem. Of the facts, Van Helsing says, keep them safe, for there is in them much of treasure. So the facts themselves are very valuable. However, what makes Van Helsing different, as I said, from the others, is that he is both an empiricist and a mystic. That is, he believes in things in the universe that you cannot see, and abstract entities like faith. And so Van Helsing is a much more balanced version of all of the children of light, because he contains both empiricism and its opposite, which is mysticism and a belief in all kinds of things in life that cannot be known through empiricism. Van Helsing actually straddles those two worlds. Finally, on 271, which is still chapter 17, is, I'll find this passage right away. Right here. So this is Dr. Seward's diary, 29th of September. This is Van Helsing talking, I believe. "Because it is part of our terrible story, a part of poor dear Lucy's death and all that led to it, because in the struggle we have before us to get rid of this terrible monster, we must all have the knowledge," he means empirical facts, "and all the help we can." So the idea is that if we just collect all of this stuff, everything is going to work out fine. So that's my discussion of empiricism and work in Dracula.